Greetings, this is a reading of the book The Airship Golden Hind. Some of the language in this book has not aged well and is indeed no longer politically correct. Take caution when listening to this visual audio book. Footage and photography are provided by Photations. At Photations, we believe that the world would be a better place if people spent their time being creative. Join us in practicing art so we all can be the master of art. Find art prints available at our store www.photationsstore.com. Keep our artwork alive by making a donation at photationsdonations.com. The Airship Golden Hind by Percy F. Westerman. Chapter 20 to the End of 64 by Jove. Kenyon, what's that over on our starboard boat? Exclaimed Bramston. Kenneth raised his binoculars and focused them on a dark object in the direction indicated. That, he replied after a brief survey, is a Z. There's not much mistake about that. She is also in difficulties, apparently, since Zeps don't generally assume an angle of 45 degrees. It is also reasonable to assume that it is 64, since we know that von Zinzig was keeping a course slightly divergent to ours. The southerly wind has evidently driven her northward. Fosterdike was asleep in his cabin, but upon hearing the news he hurried to the navigation room. Are we Pharisees or good Samaritans, sir? Inquired Kenyon. Do we pass by on the other side, or do we stop to render assistance? It strikes me that something more than assistance is required, replied the baronet. Obviously our friend von Zinzig is out of the running. His airship is down and out. If there are any of the crew on board, we'll be just in time to prevent them losing the number of their mess. 64 was in a very bad way. The after part of the envelope was half submerged. The rearmament gondola was entirely so. The foremost car was rising and falling owing to the slight buoyancy of the further ballonets. At one moment it was 30 or 40 feet above the water. At another it was smacking the surface and sending the spray far and wide. Keep to windward, ordered Fosterdike. There are men still on board, replied Peter. A dozen more or less are hanging on to the catwalk. It'll be rather a proposition to get them off, said the baronet. We haven't a boat, neither apparently have they, and I don't like the idea of running alongside a half-submerged gas bag. With this heavy swell, there's no knowing what might happen. We might run out a hawser and take her in tow, suggested Kenyon. I mean, tow her until we get the crew off by means of an endless line. Might do, half agreed Fosterdike. It would be decidedly awkward if our head fell away and we drifted in broadside on to the wreckage. We'll try it. Tell Jackson to get a hawser ready and see there is a slip fitted in case we have to cast off in a hurry. Already, several of the ballonets at first sight seemed beyond repair had been patched up, while the fortunate discovery of 2 flasks of compressed rhodium gave the Golden Hind considerable buoyancy, so that she was no longer dependent upon the lift of her 6 planes. Yet the prospect of having to take on board the weighty crew would seriously threaten the buoyancy of the airship. Luckily we are within sight of our goal, said Fosterdike. We can sacrifice a quantity of our stores. The reserve fresh water tank can be started to 250 gallons. Less of water ought to make a considerable difference. Leading hand Jackson, with the help of 4 or 5 of the crew, soon made the necessary preparations. By this time the Golden Hind had approached to within 100 yards of the disabled Zeppelin, the crew of which, half in doubt as to what was going to happen, were signaling and shouting frantically for help. Rescuing the crew of the Hilda P. Murchison was child's play to this Compendium goodness only knows how we are going to establish communication. Her blessed envelope is in the way. Thrice the Golden Hind sailed over her crippled rival. The trailing hawser glided over the rounded surface of the gasbag, but none of the men made any attempts to leave the gondolas and secure the rope. It afterward transpired that the aluminium envelope was setting and whipping to such an extent that the vertical shaft through it by which access could be made to the upper surface of the gas bag was impracticable. Anyone attempting to ascend by that way would almost certainly be crushed to death. "Can't the lubbers see the hawser?" asked Fosterdike impatiently, "or have they all got the wind up so frightfully that they can't lift a hand to help themselves? Get in that hawser, Jackson. We'll try approaching to leeward this time and see if they've got the sense to veer a rope." The maneuver required very careful execution. The Golden Hind, descending until her fuselage was but a few feet above the sea, approached carefully. She had to be kept under control up to a certain point, when way had to be taken off her. If she stopped too soon, she would drift away before communication could be established. As she carried on even a few yards too much, there was a danger of her overlapping envelope colliding nose on with the wrecked Zeppelin. This time the Hun showed decided activity. They bent a line to an inflated into rubber light belt and threw the latter into the sea. Unfortunately, they did not take into account the fact that the Zeppelin was drifting to leeward as fast as the light belt. When they realized what was happening, one of the crew jumped overboard and towed the line 100 yards or so away. "Now there's a chance of doing something," commented Fosterdike, telegraphing for a touch ahead with no one and two motors. As the Golden Hind passed immediately over the life buoy, a grapnel, lowered from the after part of the fuselage, engaged the rope, and in a remarkably short space of time a stout hawser connected the British airship with the still buoyant bows of the German. Fosterdike waited until the Golden Hind had one round and was pointing downwind. Then he ordered easy ahead with the two forward motors. This gave sufficient tension to the hawser, which was now inclined at an angle of about 30 degrees. A snatch block with an endless line was then allowed to run down to the hawser. "Now the rest is easy," declared Fosterdike, but for once at least he was greatly mistaken. The first of the Huns arrived in the bowline on board the Golden Hind. "How many are there?" asked Fosterdike. "We've asked 20, replied the German, holding up the fingers of both hands twice in order to make his meaning clear. More Huns emerging from the further gondola of 64 confirmed the man's statement. One was evidently an officer, but his features did not in the least resemble those of Count von Senzig, whose photograph had appeared some time back in the illustrated papers. 17 Huns were transshipped in about as many minutes. The 18th was halfway along the Towton hawser when Fosterdike shouted, "Let go." Leading hand Jackson obeyed the order instantly. The ring of the Sandhouse slip was knocked clear, and the hawser fell with a splash into the sea. The Golden Hind, released from the drag of the partly water-logged Zeppelin, shot ahead. She was only just in time. The baronet had noticed a tongue of flame issuing from the center gondola of 64 how the fire was caused was a mystery, since had the Huns wished to destroy the wreckage, they would have waited until the last man was cleared of the Zeppelin. Possibly the wiring of the electric stove had short-circuited when in contact with the salt water. In less than 15 seconds from the time the hawser had been slipped, the hydrogen escaping from the leaky ballonets was ignited. The aluminum gas pipe was surrounded by flames. The heat caused the gas in the still intact ballonets to expand, affording sufficient lifting power to heave the wreckage almost clear of the water. The remaining Huns, keenly alive to the terrible danger, promptly dumped into the sea. Then, with a terrific glare, the remaining ballonets burst, and the shattered wreckage, sizzling as it came into contact with the cold water, disappeared beneath the surface, leaving a steadily widening circle of oil surmounted by a dense pall of black smoke to mark the scene of the end of 64. Before the evil-smelling vapor had dispersed, the Golden Hind, turning head to one, was over the spot searching for possible survivors. For half an hour she cruised round, but her efforts to rescue the three Huns were unavailing. The men had either been stunned by the explosion or had been hit by falling wreckage. Amongst them was Under Lieutenant Hans Luder, who, by resolutely refusing to leave his command until the rest of the crew were safe, had proved that all Hun officers were not of the von Syndig type. Several of the rescued Germans could speak English, but they were decidedly reticent. In the back of their minds they rather feared that they were in for a bad time. They knew that their late captain had been practically outlawed, and that he was wanted by the authorities for having, amongst other misdemeanors, destroyed the Fremantle aerodrome by means of an incendiary bomb. They rather expected that they would be blamed for the acts of their fugitive superior. On the other hand, they were grateful to their rescuers for having saved their lives, and with typical Teutonic reasoning, they eventually decided that one way to repay the kindness and to ingratiate themselves in the eyes of the Englishmen would be to give away their former officers. The spokesman led off by informing Sir Reginald Fosterdike that Under Lieutenant Hans Luder was the person who dropped the incendiary bomb from the observation basket in the hope that it would destroy the Golden Hind. He was, of course, acting under Count von Sinzig's orders, remarked Fosterdike truly. Where is Herr Luder? Dead, was the reply. He was one of the three left on 64. And Count von Sinzig was one of the other two. The German airman shrugged his shoulders and made a gesture of disgust. He still rankled over his captain's cowardly desertion. It was long obvious to all the survivors of the 64 that von Sinzig had no intention of summoning aid. 8 hours had elapsed since he began his flight in the Albatross, and that time he must have sighted several vessels, since the scene of the disaster was not many miles from one of the great Atlantic trade routes. Captain Count von Sindig left 64 soon after daybreak this morning. Herr, replied the German. At 7 o'clock, to be exact. Left how? Demanded Fosterdike sharply. In an Albatross monoplane. He was last seen going east-northeast. Fosterdike dismissed his informant and turned to Kenyon and Bramston. The cunning old rascal, he exclaimed. I see his little game now. He's completing the final stage by aeroplane. I suppose by this time he's won the Chau's prize, but I don't envy him. Will you enter a protest, sir? Asked Peter. Protest not much, replied the baronet emphatically. He's 17. Huns can do the protesting if they want to, and I rather fancy they will. There's many a slut, quoted Kenyon. He may not complete the course after all.